Oh, you scared the bejesus out of me. Wait, what are you doing here? Are we on already? Shoot, gimme just a moment. Hi, you magnificent people. My name is Sam, and welcome to Steeped in Irony, a tea channel, but not like all the others because I make dumb jokes and don't take myself too seriously. I'm absolutely chuffed you're here. Why, you ask? Because while I was researching today's topic, I realised what an absolute rollercoaster ride Korea's tea history is, which always makes for an exciting story to tell. So, if you, like me, have a flair for the melodramatic, enjoy political intrigue, power struggles, corruption, redemption, and, of course, tea, then please, watch your step as you enter the carriage and buckle the fuck up because there are plenty of steep drops, twists, turns, and loop-de-loops ahead. And the ride starts now. Like every great roller coaster in story, we begin with a suspension of disbelief. According to a Korean legend, tea was first brought to Korea by, oh boy, I'm probably going to butcher this, Ho Hwang-ok, soon-to-be wife to the god king Kim Suro, a princess from Ayutthaya, most likely the name of a time-forgotten kingdom in either India or somewhere in Southeast Asia. She brought as a part of her dowry a large amount of tea seeds and had them planted in the mountains near Gimhae, Suro's seat of power during the Three Kingdoms period, or so the story goes. And, as always, this first story has little or no historical or scientific backing, and not just because it claims Kim Suro allegedly hatched from an egg sent down from the heavens. Can you imagine? Despite her importance in the myth, there don't appear to be any reliable documents citing Ho Hwang-ok as a real person at all, even though Kim Suro definitely was. What this means for tea is that it was almost certainly not introduced to Korea by India or anywhere else in Southeast Asia, and was instead brought to Korea during the unified Silla period between the 7th and 10th centuries as a part of the unstoppable wave of Buddhism that spread throughout the region. Silla's monastic elite were regularly sailing across the Yellow Sea to study in the most prestigious Chinese monasteries of the Tang dynasty. While there, they discovered that the Chinese monks were using compressed tea cakes as a cognitive stimulant to stay sharp and present during long, grueling hours of meditation. One in particular, Kim Dae-ryom, in the year 828, returned from one of these envoys with a large amount of tea seeds and knowledge on the soil conditions needed to grow them, found suitable terroir in the Jiri Mountains just outside the capital, and began planting them. As these monks returned to Korea with crates of Buddhist scriptures, and now had access to locally sourced leaves, it inspired an intense devotion to the daily tea ritual. And because tea culture was so closely intertwined with Buddhism, the state-sanctioned religion during the Silla and Goryeo dynasties, this meant that tea culture had become common in every sector of society. In 1123, a diplomat from Song dynasty China named Xu Jing rolled up to the peninsula and basically wrote a star-struck review in his travelogue, as he noticed the locals were happily tossing back tea 3 times a day, an unheard-of habit even in China, where it had had many more centuries to develop into a cultural phenomenon. The Goryeo elite were completely, utterly unhinged for the Song dynasty's powdered, stone-ground tea, and at its height, tea became officially sanctioned by the state itself, which, and this part's super important, simultaneously tied state and religion together, and also loosened the ties between religion and tea. The royal court established a dedicated government bureau called the Tabong, which was explicitly in charge of overseeing palace tea etiquette, serving foreign dignitaries, and managing royal ceremonies. This policy of protecting the state through protecting the faith created a symbiotic wheel of mutual interest. But the economic side effects of all this national hype were staggering. The crown started showering elite monasteries with tax-exempt land grants, commercial monopolies, and slaves. Because tea was already the defining luxury commodity of high society, the temples realized that controlling the production, harvesting, and processing of premium brick and powdered tea was basically a license to print money. Before long, the monasteries morphed into medieval corporate conglomerates, amassing vast fortunes, operating high-interest loan shark schemes for merchants, and monopolizing local wine operations in addition to controlling all things tea. Predictably, sitting on top of an untaxed commercial empire worth a king's ransom led to systemic rot. The highly revered positions of power within these temples became entirely nepotistic, functioning as a soft landing pad for the younger sons and uncles of the aristocracy who needed to look distinguished. Monks were no longer seen as teachers of the Dharma, but as corrupt, wealthy oligarchs, land-hoarding and politicking around the royal court. When the state's treasury eventually ran empty, ordinary peasants were left to foot the bill, sparking widespread civil unrest. This unchecked corporate greed is precisely what fueled the rise of the Neo-Confucian scholars, who looked at the bloated temple economy, saw it as a cancer precipitating the fall of the state, and used the anti-Buddhist public sentiment to back General Yi Song-ge's hostile takeover in 1392, ensuring the Joseon dynasty's first order of business was the complete, ruthless liquidation of the monastic empire. Because the new Confucian reformers were obsessed with order, propriety, and highly structured ancestral rites, they ran into a bit of a dilemma. They couldn't tell the entire ruling class to stop hosting guests, and they certainly didn't want everyone at every event absolutely trolleyed on rice wine. Since tea signalled restraint, clarity, and dignity, the Joseon scholars executed a bit of cultural rebranding. They hijacked the practice, stripped away every ounce of Buddhist monastic vibes, and codified it into the strict state manuals as dadi, which literally translates to tea rite. But here is the beautiful twist. While they turned a drink that used to be about finding Zen into a mandatory civic duty designed to reinforce social hierarchy and filial piety, the actual philosophy of dadi remained fiercely independent. Unlike the rigid, don't breathe the wrong way or the master will exile you vibes of Japanese Chanoyu, Korean dadi was built entirely around a naturalistic sensibility, ease, and absolute chill. It was an exercise in mindful presence and friendship, focused on sharing a warm moment rather than pulling off a flawless performance. The leaf initially survived the fall of its creators simply because it had made itself indispensable to the basic fabric of Korean social life. But that's the key word there, initially. It didn't die with Buddhism right away, but what followed, completely unbeknownst to the Joseon dynasty, was an agonizingly slow, multi-century administrative faceplant. After the Neo-Confucians tore down the monastic order, this new regime, determined to keep the flame of Buddhism stamped out, put an aggressive economic chokehold on tea. They slapped an extortionate luxury tax on the crops and treated the leaf as an overindulgent decadence rather than a daily necessity, trying to maintain the culture but completely remove it from its Buddhist roots. What they actually did was dry up the domestic market for anyone who wasn't a part of the nobility. The real kicker was that the crown still demanded the finest, hand-plucked spring flushes, so they structured the tax system as a mandatory tribute quota. They essentially forced the southern agricultural communities to hand over their premium flushes with no compensation, while simultaneously taxing the farmers on the land itself and dissuading common folk from participating in the culture due to high prices. It became such a toxic, abusive environment that the poor farmers realised owning an ancestral tea bush was a one-way ticket to financial ruin. Left with a choice between bankruptcy or lifelong servitude to a regime that had become just as corrupt as the one it overthrew, farmers took up their torches and axes and literally burned down their own fields just to declare agricultural bankruptcy and keep the state's hands out of their pockets. This self-inflicted leaf shortage is exactly why tea went from a flourishing national institution to a total ghost on the peninsula, an endangered luxury hidden away in the royal palace and by a few isolated hermits hiding out in the deep, mist-shrouded valleys away from civilization. It took 380-odd years of completely missing the mark for the royal palace to realize they had, in their systematic oppression of Buddhism, made tea completely impossible to grow sustainably. By the late 18th century, King Yongzhou looked into an empty teapot, conceded total defeat, and issued a royal decree officially scrubbing true leaf tea from palace religious rituals entirely, replacing it with basic boiled water or wine, because the administrative burden had nearly killed the tradition. The dynasty had forced the general public to stop drinking true tea altogether, and they turned to roasted barley, corn, and ginger tisanes, just so they had something warm in their mugs. And this is where the ride makes a final, brilliant manoeuvre before the close. By the early 19th century, a now legendary Buddhist monk named Cheol decided he'd had quite enough of tea and its roots in Buddhist teachings being considered taboo, and through a series of guides, poems, and songs, set out to revive the dying culture. He stepped out of his isolated southern sanctuary and teamed up with a crew of exiled, fiercely political scholars, including the famous calligrapher Kim Jong-hee, who had been booted out of the royal court for crossing the stuffy Joseon authorities. They started forming these underground intellectual salons, writing letters to one another begging for contraband leaf, and using the simple act of sharing a proper brew as a silent protest against the corrupt politics of the day. Cheol codified this homegrown rescue mission by penning the Dongda Song, or the Hymn to Korean Tea, reminding everyone that the clarity of a proper tea buzz and the depth of spiritual enlightenment weren't at odds with one another. They were completely in accord. They took a dying spark from the ashes of a forgotten empire and kept it alive right under the noses of the Confucian tax collectors. But for all their efforts, it wasn't actually this group of revivalist philosophers who brought tea culture back from the brink in Korea. It was the Japanese. Japan had just spent the late 19th century sprinting through the Meiji Restoration, rapidly modernizing their entire society after America pried open their borders. They handled that change so well, they came out the other side an industrialized, resource-hungry global superpower. But being a relatively small, mountainous island nation meant they were fast running out of domestic real estate to grow the massive amounts of green tea needed to satisfy their empire's exploding habits. So they looked directly across the water at the Korean peninsula. When Japan forcefully annexed Korea in 1910, they completely restructured the landscape. But to understand how they managed to put their imperial boots on the country's agricultural neck, we have to rewind a bit, because this wasn't a sudden land grab, it was a 34-year squeeze. The setup began all the way back in 1876 with the Treaty of Ganghwa, which was basically Japan using the exact same gunboat diplomacy tactics America had used on them a few decades earlier. They rocked up with armed warships, pointed their cannons at the coast, and forced Korea to sign an unequal contract that opened up local ports to Japanese merchants and gave them total immunity from local laws. It was the ultimate toxic foot in the door, declaring Korea independent on paper, just to legally alienate it from its historic ties with China. Fast forward through a couple of decades of deep economic infiltration and political bullying, and we reach the Ulsa Treaty of 1905. Japanese officials literally marched armed troops into the Korean palace, surrounded the cabinet ministers, and forced them to sign away their own sovereignty at gunpoint. This stripped Korea of its entire foreign policy, handed supreme control to a Japanese resident general and turned the nation into a protected puppet state, completely locking down the administration before the final annexation in 1910. With every single square inch of Korean soil legally and forcefully captured, imperial administrators looked at the southern mist and perfect terroir of places like Bosong and realized it was an untapped gold mine. Because the native Korean tea culture had been left wild and forgotten for centuries after the Joseon tax collectors ruined the market, Japanese industrialists stepped in, cleared the hillsides, and mapped out those sweeping, terraced rows you see on tourism brochures today. They replaced centuries of traditional Korean pan firing with their signature high-volume, steam-fixed green tea production. So while Chowi and his rebel salons saved the spiritual soul of Korean tea, it was 20th century foreign industrialists who built the giant commercial engine that thrust the leaf back into the modern mainstream. So, if we take a big step back and look at this entire dizzying track we've just travelled, the real takeaway from the story of tea in Korea is one of seamless adaptability. You see, while China doubled down on ancient imperial heritage, and Japan threw itself into light-speed modernization, tea culture in Korea survived by realizing that sometimes you just have to lean into the curves, shift your weight, and trust that no matter how steep the drop, how unequal the loop, or how brutal the twist, if you just hang on, eventually you'll end up back at the station. And that, esteemed park-goers, brings us back to our station. Thank you for accompanying me on this ride. Please watch your step on the way out, enjoy a complimentary air kiss, mwah. And if you would like to know when the next ride is available, the best way to do that is to press that little subscribe button somewhere below. Until next time, everyone, enjoy your lives and always remember, steep, sip, stay curious.